Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you can join us today. Joining me, and I'm very excited about this, is Congressman Mike Gallagher. He's from Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District. He's also now chairman of the House Select Committee on Competition with the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to talk about this. Storied career. The man is very, very educated, but we don't necessarily need to get into a lot. I always appreciate folks who come in and folks who've gone into Congress who have advanced degrees, especially on the conservative side of things. Served as a Marine in Iraq, retired as a captain, served with General Petraeus. Congressman, let's start here. What made you decide to run for Congress in the first place?
Well, I had moved back to Wisconsin to work on a presidential campaign. Our governor, Scott Walker, who's a great governor, ran for president.
I was a volunteer as well at that time.
Phenomenal guy, did great things for the state. And each campaign usually has like a national security guy. So I was the national security advisor on that campaign. And quite honestly, I was not planning on anything. That was my first introduction to politics, but I was like the nerdy policy guy you lock in a room and don't let talk politics.
I resemble that remark.
So when that ended, I moved back to Green Bay, which is where I'm from, and I was sort of embarking on a private sector career when my congressman unexpectedly retired. And some people reached out to me to see if I was interested in running. And quite honestly, my first reaction, I was very hesitant because I had no experience. I didn't know how to fundraise. Never been in front of a camera. But here I was writing op-eds, kind of criticizing the direction of U.S. foreign policy. And so I felt like this was an opportunity to put my money where my mouth is. And I also felt as a younger guy running for office, I was 31, 32 at the time, it'd be good to have a little bit of a generational shift. And so, and then, factor in all the other things about service to country and feeling like I owed a debt to that country and my family and all that stuff.
Let's talk about this, though, because you made the jump. You served in the military right after. Actually, I want to start here with what was it like jumping from being an undergraduate at Princeton into joining the Marine Corps, and then serving in Iraq? I mean, we're talking about two very different worlds and a career you don't think about. Very much in the late 1960s, you would have seen something like that, but not in the 2010s.
Yeah, and Princeton had a decent Army ROTC program, didn't have naval ROTC on campus, and so I went to Officer Candidate School for the Marine Corps, and I think for the 2 years before me, nobody had gone. My class had 3 people, but it was very small, right? Yeah. So it just wasn't, you go to Princeton, usually you go get a job on Wall Street, and then you make money, and military service at the time was not sort of viewed as like an option. I sort of fell into it because I don't come from a military family, but I became fascinated with the Middle East. I was in college when we invaded Iraq. Right. I started to become interested in sort of terrorist groups and their targeting methods, and then I changed my major junior year to start studying Arabic. And so the more I went down that intellectual rabbit hole, I started to think, okay, what does one do with these skills?
Sure.
And I thought, I don't want to go into academia. I don't want to go, I had no interest in going to Wall Street. And I'm like, what about the military? And the more I researched the military, the Marine Corps jumped out as just this amazing challenge. And so it was a tough adjustment. I mean, I played sports growing up, but I had never really lifted weights. And so even the physical aspect, I had to get myself ready for the physical fitness test. I think a lot of my peers at Princeton were kind of thinking, what are you doing? Why would you do this?
Sure, right.
Why are you volunteering to go to Iraq right now? But for me, I just loved the idea of the challenge, mental, physical, the leadership challenge. I love the idea of being able to sort of explore this intellectual interest I had in the Middle East, apply my language and regional skills in a very real way. And again, I love this idea of being able to serve my country. And it just had this sort of romantic appeal to me. So even though I didn't come from a military family, or even though none of my peers were really making the same decision, without a doubt, it was the best decision I made with my life.
So huge debates and discussions, not just in Congress, but elsewhere, about the nation's intelligence services and how that informs our public policy. You come out of that background in the military, and military intelligence is a very specialized portion of this. But how does that now inform your experiences? How do they inform your approaches to the debates and discussions that are happening? You've got a very unique insight into all this.
Well, I'd say 2 things. One is something I call the Lance Corporal test, and that means that I was at I say my Marines were at the tip of the spear, where we were sort of in a very tactical environment in Western Iraq, and we were the human intelligence unit attached to an infantry battalion. So we were in charge of doing interrogations and source operations in order to help the infantry battalion get bad guys, keep the Marines safe, et cetera, et cetera. even then, so it was our job to know the area and what was happening better than anyone else. Even then, with a granular level understanding of tribal dynamics, of economic dynamics, of terrorist dynamics, it was very difficult to make sense of what was going on. And I just remember we spent 5 months on a deployment looking for a high-value individual, a bad guy, and we just couldn't find him. And finally, through a mixture of good source work, smart Marines, and a little bit of luck, we found this guy. But it was just so murky. And so I always think when people in D.C. make these very confident pronouncements or these high confidence intelligence assessments coming out of the DNI or the CIA, I just try and apply the Lance Corporal test. I'm like, how does this filter down to the Lance Corporal who's actually at the tip of the spear, who's got to implement some of these policies? And in my experience with intelligence is it's rarely certain, and really things get exciting when you start combining multiple forms of intelligence, human and SIGINT and imagery intelligence, which means you just need people to work together and check their egos at the door. The other thing I'd say is that I do by and large, I know we've had a lot of scandals in our intelligence community in recent years. Quite honestly, a lot of those shocked me. As someone who came from the intelligence community, I never thought we'd see what we saw with Russiagate, with FISA court abuses. I do think, however, you have to make a distinction between the leadership in some of these organizations,
good point,
and the rank and file.
Of course,
and by and large, I think we have rank and file that just want to serve their country.
Right,
they want to do a difficult job well, and I don't think in some instances they're being served well by their leadership at present.
It's interesting because in the conversations that I've had with folks in that community, it's right. The folks who sort of are they're outside of politics, and they want to be outside of politics. They just want to serve and do what they want to serve. Now, on the other hand, you are in now a political role, but and I say this. Well, let me ask you this. Because I get the sense you don't approach this as a political person. You approach it from the policy goal, right? Elections have consequences because they want to impact the policy. I mean, am I right or wrong here?
You're right. And that's my fundamental orientation, right? I came at this as a policy nerd. I mean, I was a Marine, and then I, used my GI Bill to kind of study policy a little bit more, and then I did policy on the Hill as a staffer. However, I think I've gained, and it really started in working on the Walker campaign, where I went in sort of thinking, I do policy, I don't do politics, and foreign policy must be removed from politics. Okay, I get that as sort of the ideal, but in practice, for your policy to have life and legs, it needs to be politically viable. So these things have to work together. You can't entirely divorce policy.
That's the beauty of the system.
Exactly, from political realities. And certainly the essence of the system is not allowing sort of unelected policy mandarins to control everything, right? The people are in charge.
Exactly.
They elect representatives to make decisions, and we have to do robust oversight of the executive branch, and then we've fallen away from that. So in some ways, though I maintain my orientation, sort of a policy-first orientation, I've gained a respect for the unique interplay of politics and policy, and how important it is for me as someone who is naturally introverted and probably more comfortable writing a white paper. It is to get out there and sell policy. I think is important in formats that people can understand, whether it's on TV or on a podcast or on radio. And that's something I've really had to get comfortable with, and I still have to work at every day.
Well, let's drill down a little bit, because I want to move away from the border stuff for a minute, because that's obviously a huge national security issue. Let's start with your chairmanship of this select committee on competition with the Chinese Communist Party. At least I think I'm getting that
China.
name right.
Yeah, it's a long
let's
name.
talk about why the committee was formed, but also, I remember before 9/11 how China was the main threat. We're seeing that resurgence now, especially as the geopolitical situation changes in Central Europe. Talk about China and why we need to be focusing on why the committee was created.
Well, Speaker McCarthy, to his credit, had the idea for creating the committee in order to he talks about it in terms of a visit to Normandy he had, and talking to then Speaker Pelosi, saying, wouldn't it be great if we could prevent something like this from happening? And so I think that motivated his desire to create a sense of urgency around deterring aggression from the Chinese Communist Party before it's too late. On a practical level, too, because China, this competition, we call it, though as I've said, it's not a polite tennis match. I think it's an existential competition over sort of what life will look like over the next 100 years, if not longer. Because it's a whole of society of competition, legislation and policy naturally transcends various committee jurisdiction.
Sure.
Put differently, no one committee is in charge of China in Congress. So you need a committee like ours to play that coordinating function. So I think about us on the committee having two roles or two missions that the Speaker has given us. One is to explain the why to our colleagues and the American people. Why does it matter? Why should someone in Northeast Wisconsin or Washington, D.C. care about the threat posed by the CCP? And two, to be that policy coordinating, that policy accelerator and incubator so that good ideas don't die in a divided Congress. And the Speaker has one sort of entity he can point to and say, okay, I want to do X on China. Let's get it done. Let's work through all the complex intercommittee egos that we need to sort of get stuff done in this Congress. That's what we're trying to do and elevate the issue and get stuff done even in divided government.
I want to drill down on that. So where do you think, if we don't pay attention, where are we going to be a century from now?
Well,
and if we do pay attention, where are we going to be a century from now?
I say even I sort of think about it as a short-term sprint and a long-term marathon.
Right.
To borrow Pillsbury's very powerful metaphor, I think. The short-term sprint is deterring war over Taiwan in the next 5 years. And that is, I think things are headed in a bad direction. I think we've entered the window of maximum danger. I'm happy to talk more about that. But I think our primary goal is to deter war in the next 5 years. And that's sort of the short-term sprint.
Sure.
And if you don't win that sprint, it's as if you don't even qualify for the long-term marathon. Over the long term, I think to sort of think about what life would look like in a world dominated by China, where we're a secondary power.
Right.
And I don't think they have in mind this sort of balance of power between us. I think they have in mind global dominance.
Right.
Just look at what's happening inside of China, right? Look what's happening in Xinjiang, right? I mean, that's sort of, they're perfecting a model of techno-totalitarian control that they want to export not only throughout the rest of China, but increasingly abroad. This is a world in which you can't say what you think for fear of angering your overlords. It's a world in which various minority groups are attacked for the sake of Han supremacy. It's a world in which every aspect of your daily life is monitored by the party. It's sort of Orwell on steroids.
Right.
I think that is sort of the alternate model of government that we're up against here, as opposed to the free society that we're trying to protect and pass on to the next generation.
Orwell
America.
could not have conceived of a situation in which we could be surveilled quite in that way. I mean, he sort of hinted around it, but if he'd ever known that there was this thing called a cell phone that you carry with you all the time,
that's right,
he would have been horrified by it. So a couple of weeks ago, we had on Javed Ali, who's a former director of the NCTC, National Counterterrorism Center, now teaches at the University of Michigan. And he has a very interesting theory about declaring cartels as terrorist organizations. You've just heard Secretary Mayorkas testify. I know you've got some criticisms there I want to talk about. But let's talk about the cartel situation, the border situation, and this theory of Professor Ali's on this, and want to get your thoughts on this.
Well, the first and most obvious thing to say is the border is in total chaos right now. Just total chaos. When I was in uniform still, I did this kind of fellowship thing where I floated around different parts of the intelligence community, spent a brief period of time at DEA, and went down to the southern border in El Paso and got to survey what was happening there. I mean, that at the time, it seemed like a massive problem. Compared to the present day, I mean, this is just total chaos. And what makes it, I think, frustrating is that this is a fixable problem, right? We have the technology. We potentially could have the manpower if we were what we lack is the willpower to secure the southern border. Perhaps you never get 100% operational control of the southern border, but you can get darn near close. Is my belief. If we reverse the disastrous open border policy that we have right now. So that's point one. Point two, I've actually supported legislation in the past to designate the cartels as terrorist organizations. The intent really being to unlock the full suite of tools we have in terms of the federal government to get at these organizations which are wreaking utter havoc on American society. Third point, the thing I'm most interested in as chairman of the Select Committee on China is this kind of unholy alliance between the drug cartels and the Chinese entities that are supplying all the precursor chemicals for fentanyl. And it used to be the case that a lot of this stuff was coming directly from China through the mail, by the way, into America. But now they're sort of sending the precursors to Mexico. They'll produce very lethal fentanyl pills. They'll traffic it across the southern border. And this is killing 80,000 Americans a year. I mean, you sort of think about it as a reverse opium war on America, with the caveat that we don't know how intentional it is. I'm not sure, Xi Jinping. I don't have evidence to say that Xi Jinping declared this war, but 80,000 Americans a year are dying at the hands of the drug cartels, and they're getting the precursor chemicals from China. That is a massive problem for American society, and we should use every tool at our disposal to get control of our southern border and protect American lives.
Let's talk about the current administration and their approach or non-approach to border security, and Secretary Mayorkas seeming to not understand there is a problem, or is it that they do understand and they don't care? Your thoughts here?
I've struggled with this intellectually because it just seems so obvious to me. It's obvious to me that we don't want people to come here illegally,
right? And
for people who want to come here legally, we should make it easy and transparent. I mean, based on the needs of our economy,
absolutely,
right?
Of course.
In terms of the leadership or lack thereof in the Democratic Party, I'm left to conclude that. Maybe the most charitable interpretation is they feel like America has a humanitarian responsibility to accept all of these economic migrants who are pretending to be asylees. But the sort of perversity of that is that a lot of legitimate asylees get crowded out in the process. And largely what we're seeing are economic migrants across the southern border. And we have a totally messed up asylum process. I guess more cynical interpretations are out there, but I don't know. I think I think people like Mayorkas are being driven by fear of the progressive base.
Sure.
And the progressive base wants open borders.
Right.
They want open borders. I don't know why they want that, but that's what they want. I mean, they don't want to have a wall.
And our libertarian friends as well, which is astounding to me. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, that's my unsophisticated analysis of the whole thing. But it actually exacerbates. If your concerns are humanitarian, it actually exacerbates the humanitarian crisis.
Right.
And what we're seeing at the southern border is horrific.
Sure.
In terms of people dying in trucks. I mean, we're basically empowering the coyotes and the drug cartels to commit horrific human rights abuses. So it's actually more humane to have a tough border policy and have an orderly asylum process and a transparent legal immigration process.
Right. In essence, yes, you show the rules. You don't allow people to jump in line. Absolutely, you can prioritize. But let's also talk about this because I know you've spent a great deal of time looking at financial tech and how that sort of plays into both the cartels and this process. Talk about that as well.
Well, I mean, one thing I would say we do a poor job of, I would say the intelligence community in general is incorporating financial analysis into traditional intelligence analysis. And I still think we have relatively unsophisticated methods for tracking this sort of complex relationship between the cartels, between the precursor suppliers, and all the money launderers that is sort of a very poorly understood phenomenon. So one thing I'm interested in doing in my role really on the House Intelligence Committee, conducting basic oversight, is pushing the intelligence community to better understand how the money is flowing across borders, how your chemical supplier gets paid by a drug cartel, how a drug cartel gets paid. And I think, as the old saying goes, follow the money.
Sure.
And you'll learn a lot that way. I think there's been a lot of debate, too, about the role of cryptocurrency and could it potentially be used for illicit purposes. My view is there's got to be a way to apply basic anti-money laundering, know your customer rules to cryptocurrency going forward. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not on the Financial Services Committee, but there are also national security uses for cryptocurrency going forward. You saw a lot of people getting out of Ukraine use cryptocurrency in order to move value across borders. So, but by and large, this is just, and I say this with love for the rank and file in the IC that are working a hard problem. It's just not the case that your average intelligence analyst understands financial policy or how money works in the way that people on Wall Street do.
Yeah, listen, I mean, my own alma mater, William & Mary, they're doing a lot of work on both the crypto side and the blockchain side, and they've come to the conclusion it's a tool. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. It all depends on who the actors are. Listen, I know we're short on time. Before I let you go, normally I ask about outside interests, and I know you're married, you got one child, but let me ask you about, let's come back to your district, Wisconsin's 8th. If I were to take a day and go to Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District, what's the one thing that I should do? Is there one thing that I should see in your home district?
Well, you got to come during a Packers game.
Okay,
obviously.
of course.
You got to visit the Valhalla of football,
Sure.
the Mecca of football, which is Lambeau Field. That would be the one thing to do. A close second, or that you can do this prior to a football game.
Yes.
You could go dine at the fine establishment known as Gallagher's Pizza, where the tagline is Italian food I Irish Spirit, which is a restaurant my dad started
Nice.
over 20 years ago. He no longer owns it. We don't own it
Okay.
anymore, but the Gallagher's name endures. And so there's about 4 little pizza restaurants.
Corned beef
in
and
Green
cabbage
Bay.
on the pizza?
Indeed,
Or
indeed.
there
And then if
go.
you really want the complete Wisconsin experience, you got to go visit a dairy farm
Yes.
and, hang out with cows.
Yeah, I haven't been to the Wisconsin Dells. I've been wanting to do that
Dells,
as well. I
outside
heard
my
great
district,
things.
but very
Yes,
important. And then you got to have cheese curds, of
yes,
course.
that
Cheese
I've-
curds and
that I-
brats.
That
are-
I've done.
Yeah.
And my one visit to Wisconsin. But so when you're not here, what are you up to?
Hanging out with my wife and
Yeah.
2 daughters. I have
2 daughters.
Yeah,
Okay,
we
sorry,
have
yes.
a 2.5-year-old and an 8-month-old, and every marginal minute I spend with them, and all the cheesy things about being a parent are true, and it's just like I'm infatuated with my daughters. They're
Listen,
funny.
it only gets better. I got 2
Yeah.
girls, and they're now 18 and 21, and it only gets better over time.
love
The
it.
more that they
I
sort of
love
learn. Congressman Mike Gallagher, thank you so very much
Thank you,
for
sir.
joining us. This has been another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As always, you can check us out. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can find us wherever fine podcasts are purveyed. But if you're listening to us, you can also find us on YouTube. Please recommend us to your friends, recommend us to your family members, recommend us to your family friends, your friends' families. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.